December 21st, 1945. The telephone rang early in the morning at Eisenhower's office in Washington. On the other end, a voice delivered the news. George Patton was dead. For 3 years, Dwight Eisenhower had walked a political tightrope, critiquing his most brilliant field commander in public, yet relying on him privately to achieve victories no one else could. He'd defended Patton before skeptical politicians, smoothed things over with uneasy allies, and held the general in check whenever his impulsiveness threatened to spark diplomatic crises. Now Patton was gone, and for the first time since the war began, Eisenhower was free to speak without restraint. What he said in the days and months that followed laid bare a conviction he'd kept hidden behind a veil of necessity, that George S. Patton wasn't merely a talented general, he was irreplaceable. Losing him felt like losing the war's deadliest weapon. Camp Meade, 1919. 2 captains in the newly formed tank corps leaned over the steel gut of a Renault FT-17, elbow-deep in oil and grease. One was George Patton, heir to an old Southern aristocratic line, already a combat veteran from the Mexican expedition and the trenches of France. The other was Eisenhower, a scholarship student from Abilene, Kansas, confined to stateside service during World War I, but burning to prove himself. Patton's family fortune allowed him the luxury of bold ideas. Eisenhower, dependent on his military paycheck, learned caution in his speech. Yet side by side, they drafted plans for rapid armored thrusts, argued over suspension designs, and scribbled maps of battles not yet fought. They believed tanks would reshape warfare, fast, overwhelming machines that would shatter enemy lines and rewrite the rules of battle. The army brass, still wedded to horse cavalry and infantry massed in trenches, dismissed their vision, threatened careers, even threatened to shut the tank experiment down entirely. Patton shrugged off the warnings. Eisenhower learned to temper his enthusiasm with tact. Still, a bond of respect and shared purpose formed between them. 2 young officers confident they were on the cusp of a revolution. 23 years later, those 2 captains had risen to the top of the Allied command. Eisenhower wore the title Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Patton had become the most feared general in the U.S. Army. Their friendship endured, but the dynamic between them changed. Eisenhower now had to govern Patton's battlefield ferocity, balancing his friend's eagerness to strike with the delicate needs of a multinational coalition. He had to explain Patton's outbursts to President Roosevelt, to Prime Minister Churchill, to Chief of Staff Marshall. He had to decide when to unleash Patton's unstoppable drive and when to hold him back for the sake of politics and diplomacy. Patton, for his part, bristled at being managed. He saw Eisenhower as overly cautious, more concerned with alliances and press releases than smashing the Wehrmacht. The tension simmered beneath every operation, a constant pulse beneath the war's grand strategy. August 1943, Sicily. Patton, newly in command of the 7th Army, toured field hospitals and encountered soldiers shattered by constant bombardment, men shaking with what was then called shell shock. To Patton, they were shirkers, unfit for combat. In 2 separate incidents, he slapped private soldiers across the face, cursed them with epithets, and ordered them shot if they ever collapsed again. Word spread quickly. Newspapers broke the story. Politicians in Congress demanded his head, and public outrage flared. Eisenhower faced a choice: remove his most aggressive combat commander at the very moment he would be needed for the cross-channel invasion, or discipline him lightly and hope for the best. He settled on the middle path. He issued a formal reprimand, ordered Patton to issue apologies to the victims and the medical officers, made the rebuke public enough to placate critics, but stopped short of sacking him. Why? Because Operation Overlord loomed on the horizon, and Eisenhower knew that Sicily had revealed something essential. Patton's Seventh Army moved with a speed and ferocity unmatched by any other Allied formation. Against German positions near Gela and Palermo, he had outpaced Montgomery's deliberate British Eighth Army, striking harder and faster each day. The Germans had come to dread the surprise of Patton's armored thrusts. Eisenhower determined that no political uproar could justify sidelining his best weapon. Spring 1944. With D-Day only weeks away, Eisenhower confronted the greatest challenge of his command: how to fool the German High Command into defending the Pas-de-Calais rather than the Normandy beaches. The answer was Operation Fortitude, a sprawling ruse under the larger bodyguard deception plan. At its heart stood Patton, the general the Germans feared above all others. Verdun had seen his Quicksilver exploits. North Africa, his audacious flanking maneuvers. Sicily, his relentless drive. German intelligence kept relentless tabs on his movements. Eisenhower fanned this obsession, naming Patton commander of the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group preparing to cross at Calais. Patton dutifully made inspection tours of inflatable tanks and wooden landing craft, delivered speeches to Phantom headquarters staffs, and allowed Allied saboteurs to leak false information about unit strengths. Axis reconnaissance planes snapped pictures of empty camps rigged to look busy. The deception worked brilliantly. Months after the actual landings in Normandy, German reserves remained locked at Pas-de-Calais, convinced the real invasion had yet to come. But Patton seethed. He watched from a safe distance as other commanders received the acclaim at Gold and Omaha beaches. He was playing actor in a theater of phantoms while the real front raged elsewhere. Eisenhower couldn't reveal the truth, that sacrificing Patton's personal glory kept countless Allied divisions away from Normandy, saving lives. Only years later would Patton learn how completely he'd been duped and how crucial his shadow army had been to victory. By August 1st, 1944, Patton's Third Army stood ready in Normandy. Then came one of the fastest advances in modern warfare. Within 30 days, Patton's columns had swept across northern France, liberating towns at a breakneck pace and capturing tens of thousands of German troops. Bridges were seized intact, supply dumps overrun, resistance collapsed before his panzers. Eisenhower watched the reports with a mixture of pride and growing unease. This was exactly the fulfillment of the mobile tactics they'd envisaged at Camp Meade. Yet Patton's drive risked outrunning his supply lines and colliding with slower British and American formations. General Bradley's First Army advanced carefully, consolidating every river crossing. Montgomery's forces paused whenever he deemed preparations incomplete. Meanwhile, Patton thundered onward. "More fuel, more ammo," he would bark into his radio. "Send the trucks, or I'll smash a route through myself." In private, Eisenhower sometimes agreed. It was frustrating to back him off. Yet he had to juggle logistics among three armies, respect agreements with the Soviets over occupation zones, and keep coalition partners aligned. So the Third Army halted to refit, to wait for supplies the British needed equally, to allow Montgomery to keep pace. Patton saw it as wasted time. Eisenhower saw it as the price of coalition warfare. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's gamble to split the Allied lines, caught the troops unawares. Snow fell in heavy drifts, American units were encircled, and panic set in along the front. Field commanders debated fallback lines while Allied lines buckled. Eisenhower summoned an emergency meeting at his headquarters in Verdun. Seated around the table were the top brass, Bradley grimly pacing, Montgomery cautious as ever, Marshall dialing Washington for reinforcements. Then Eisenhower looked to Patton. "George," he asked quietly, "can your Third Army hit them there?" He pointed to the German salient, bulging into Allied territory. The question carried life and death stakes. Patton reached into his pocket, pulled out a small leather notebook filled with penciled calculations. He'd sketched this very scenario on the train north. "Sir," he said evenly, "if I disengage, pivot south, I can be in position to attack by December 22nd. 3 divisions, 72 hours of forced marches." Other generals scoffed at the audacity. Bradley muttered about frostbite and logistical impossibilities. But Eisenhower knew Patton's record. He simply said, "Make it so." On the morning of December 22nd, Patton's spearhead slammed into the German flank, relieving Bastogne and shifting the bulge from potential disaster to victory. It was the defining moment of their partnership. Every restraint, every apology, every political maneuver had led to this instant when Patton did the impossible. Throughout the war, Eisenhower's public pronouncements about Patton remained carefully calibrated. He praised the general's achievements without inflating him above his peers. He balanced accolades to keep British and American commanders equally valued. Privately, however, Eisenhower leaned on Patton's outlook. In staff meetings, when plans bogged down, Ike would ask, what would Patton do? Not because Patton's way was always right, but because his appetite for risk revealed opportunities others overlooked. While generals hesitated, Patton moved. While they wrangled, he acted. Eisenhower's diary entries from 1944 and 45 brimmed with admiration and anxiety. Admiration for Patton's unmatched drive, anxiety over the fallout when that drive ran into politics or supply constraints. When the war ended in Europe, Patton's talents became liabilities. His outspoken calls to push into Russia, his jokes about former Nazi officers, his bristling disdain for peacetime protocols drew outrage. Eisenhower, now wrangling politics in occupied Germany, had no choice but to strip Patton of command. It was one of the hardest orders he ever gave, a demotion that felt like a betrayal of the man who had saved the Allied line in the Ardennes and embodied the armored warfare they dreamed up 25 years earlier. Their final conversations were strained. Patton accused Ike of selling out. Eisenhower replied that politics left him no alternative. On a rainy December night, Patton suffered a fatal car accident, and 12 days later, he was gone. In the wake of his friend's death, Eisenhower's public mask fractured. In letters to confidants, in candid chats with aides, he admitted that Patton had been more than an asset. He had been indispensable. No training regimen, no staff college seminar could replicate the raw will he brought to the front. Eisenhower confessed that every time he'd held Patton back had felt like sacrificing a chance to end the war sooner. He owned up to the loneliness of command, the burden of containing a genius as volatile as Patton, balancing urgency against diplomacy. In his post-war memoirs, Eisenhower called Patton indispensable, a word freighted with meaning. It meant that without Patton's aggressive brilliance, the outcome might well have been different. He marveled at how perfectly Patton fit the chaos of war and how terribly misaligned those same qualities were in peace. In 1953, Eisenhower became President of the United States, steering the nation through the early storms of the Cold War. He never commanded armies again, but he never forgot his former subordinate and friend. In later interviews, He reminisced about their early days at Camp Meade, the agonizing choices at Sicily, Normandy's secret, the Ardennes rescue. He always returned to that theme. Managing Patton had been the hardest part of his duty, and also the most essential. Because left unchecked, Patton could have torn apart the delicate alliance that defeated Hitler. Properly guided, he became the spearhead that shattered the Third Reich. December 21, 1945, when Patton's life ended, was more than the loss of a brilliant general. It marked the passing of a force of nature, someone whose unyielding drive had turned the tide of battles when everything seemed lost. Eisenhower knew it then, and, finally free to speak without filters, he said so. Patton was irreplaceable, the war's most potent instrument. Without him, the Allied victory would have looked very different. And only in the silence that followed Patton's death could Eisenhower admit the full measure of what had been sacrificed and what had been gained by managing genius in a world at war. If you'd like more stories like these, please like and subscribe.